This goes back to that term that we looked at, the word for helper, or when God says, I will make a helper, when it talked about making Eve or making woman out of the side, and how that word actually doesn't mean assistant or anything like that. It's the indispensable other, without whom the desired good cannot happen. Let's get into actually Genesis chapter 3. We'll look at really this overview of the first account. We'll look at the structure of it. And this is where we get introduced to the serpent. And when we talk about the serpent, this is something that we spent some time with in the Sunday school, the Divine Counsel class, so I won't rehash all the material here. But the word for serpent is the Hebrew word Nachash. And it has a triple meaning to it, just based on where it's used, the vowel markers, that kind of thing. But it can mean serpent. It can also mean copper. And it can also mean a diviner, someone that gives omens or divination. And so you can see that the numbers right here, just the breakdowns of how it's used throughout the Bible. But you can see in the garden, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit here just to show you how the Nachash can mean more than just serpent, but it's when the serpent specifically talks to Eve, it says, but the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. And this is something that scholars have recognized as an omen. And so when you talk about a diviner, someone that gives omens, that the serpent is actually essentially acting in that role as a diviner. And then what's really interesting is when you look at the punishment for the serpent in the story, is the punishment is on your belly you shall go, and snakes already crawl on their belly, so it's a weird, well, aren't you already on your belly? Dust you shall eat, and snakes don't really eat dust, so that's something that probably shouldn't be taken literally. But this is more of language about being brought low to the ground. You're being brought low when you think of terms of raised up with God and then not with God, being brought low. And there's a correlation again to Isaiah. This word Hallel in Hebrew is this O-Day star from Isaiah, which many have interpreted to actually be a reference to Satan or the divine rebel from Genesis chapter 1. And this is what it says: how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. And so a lot of people have drawn a correlation to this character here and the snake from the garden. And basically the long short of it is that rather than it being a snake in the garden or a serpent in the garden, that it was actually a divine being, a spiritual being that rebelled against God and came to Eve in the garden. And so that's one way it can be interpreted. Snakes are also, there's snake imagery all across the ancient Near Eastern cultures. So again, it's just another way to perhaps think about it and to stretch the mind as we read into these stories. But that is all we'll cover on kind of the divine nature side of it. I want to focus in on the structure of the story and specifically how the snake interacts with both the man and the woman. And you can see here, this is evidence, this is where people are getting the continuation narrative, how chapter 3 is not really a stopping point. You can see this 25 right here is chapter 2, verse 25. And we looked at this last week where it talked about the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So there's no shame in the nakedness. And then you have this narrative between the snake and the woman. And this yellow just represents the snake speaking. And the green is either the woman speaking to the serpent or the woman seeing that the tree was good. He took her advice, if you will. So there's this pattern of snake says, snake says, and then woman acts upon what the snake had said. She saw that the tree was good. And then you can see here the correlating to the blue up here is that all of a sudden they knew they were naked and then they hid themselves. So now where there was no shame before, where they were not ashamed of their nakedness, now they are ashamed that they are naked and hid themselves. And this is obviously a result of eating from that tree of good and evil or good and bad. And this really, why I'm focusing in on this aspect of it, is because this is that hinge point when we look at the chiastic structure. And again, what chiastic structure means is simply you have a build-up to a climactic point in the story, and then the story reverses back on itself. And so you can see these patterns represent that, and basically the the woman and the man taking and eating from the tree and then giving some, or the woman taking and eating and then giving some to her husband, is that hinge point of this entire narrative. And so it's what's known as the test. And what's interesting about this being the test is we looked in week 1 about how we looked at how days 1 and 2, 2 and 5, and 3 and 6 are correlated. And we looked specifically within day 3 and 6 how there's a bonus act of creation. And that in day 3, it was the specifically honing in on the fruit trees, how those are likened to human beings on day 6. So you have this humans and trees being made similar, or the author wanting you to think in similar terms when you see the word human and you see the word tree. And so we talked as well about different instances where humans are correlated to trees, where this correlation is made. Again, Adam and Eve, we're in that story right now at the fall. There's Moses at the burning bush. And then all of these examples, the vine and the branches in the New Testament, and then also Jesus. The cross is actually referenced as a tree as well, where Jesus was hung and where he was killed. But the entire point of this is that trees are often used to illustrate a moment of decision and testing for humans, along with that being correlated to them. And then people, just like trees, become places of testing, which we will see in the Genesis 4 narrative. But in terms of this tree being a place of testing, the tree is where Adam and Eve are confronted. And it's the tree of knowledge and good and bad. And then again, there's this mysterious figure, whether it's a serpent, whether it's a divine being, convinces them that they're to eat this fruit. And this is what's interesting right here, and to what the serpent or this Nachash figure says to the woman is he says, "You will surely not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like gods, knowing good and bad." So again, this establishes the theme right here of trees becoming the places of testing because they are at this tree. And the reason I have the word gods underlined there is to go back with the divine council class that we did in Sunday school, was that later on in the story when God says they will be like us, knowing if they take from the tree of life. And it's actually in verse 22 where Yahweh says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us." And so there's this belief. You'll see it translated in many Bibles as "you will be like God." But if that were the case, you have to ask the question of, are they really going to be the status of Yahweh or just one of his spiritual residents and divine family members? So anyways, something fun to think about. But just like you have, again, we talked about this chiastic structure, there is the man and the woman, they're created and they're unified, and then there's a dialogue between the snake and the woman, and I know that's hard to read, but that's what this section is right here. The reversal of those two in the chiastic structure is the dialogue between God and the humans, and then ultimately the consequences for all of the parties involved, namely the serpent, the woman, and the man. And what's interesting about that in terms of structure and how this text is written is that you actually have consequences handed out in this chapter in the order that the characters appear to quote-unquote rebel. So it's first given to the snake. The snake is given his punishment. The woman is then given her punishment, and then the man is given his punishment. So we'll start with the snake. In verse 15, it says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Now, most of us in here, I think, are very familiar with this being a reference to Jesus ultimately defeating what he did with the cross. Yes, and that's absolutely true. Prior to Jesus, the question has always been, how do you interpret this? And obviously, thank goodness we live in a time where we can interpret it as Jesus. But this is the point in the story, when we look at the Bible as a whole, that the author is telling you to pay attention to genealogies. We've all had those moments where we come across a chapter of entire genealogies, and you're like, why is this in here? Well, spoiler alert, Genesis 5 is all genealogy, and Genesis 10 is all genealogy. But there's a purpose for that. This is where, and the reason I have the word seed in here is because the word literally is seed. You'll see offspring in many translations, but it's literally a seed. So think a tree has a seed, humans having seed, that kind of thing. And so there's this correlation that they want you to pay attention to, that there is going to be essentially the woman's seed versus the seed of the divine rebel moving forward in the story. The woman is then next given her punishment, or not, I shouldn't say punishment. How about judgment? That's a better word for it. But this is what the Lord says to the woman. He says, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And then your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. What's interesting, and the reason I have this word pain highlighted, is because the word pain can also mean anxiety in Hebrew, which, given the ancient context, what really the ancient context behind that, I should say, is that a woman's barrenness was viewed in ancient times as something that was very detrimental to her status in society. So I'm not telling you that it should be translated as anxiety, I'm telling you it could be. So it could be pain or anxiety, but either way, this kind of poses a really interesting question. And it's something we'll cover a little bit later on, because we've heard, at least there's in some views, that the world prior to Adam and Eve's sin at this tree was entirely perfect. If we've all heard there was no pain, there was no suffering prior to this, if this verse says, I will multiply your pain, that seems to indicate that there was some kind of pain or anxiety already present in the story. So again, we'll come back to that in a little bit, at least the theme of that. But the man's judgment comes next, and it says, because you listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Again, that word pain is the same word of anxiety. But the reason I have that, I'll stop right here. I'm not trying to pick on the women here. I'm not trying to pick on the wives. The reason I have this underlined right here and I'm making a point about it is because this phrase shows up in the story of Abraham and Sarah. When it says, you remember the story of Abraham and Sarah, she can't have a child. That kind of goes back to she thinks that she was barren, that status of society. So she says, hey, we got this slave in Egypt, sleep with her and your line can continue. We know the story of she gets really jealous of Hagar, the slave at that point. But the phrase used, this phrase, because you listen to the voice of your wife, and is the same phrasing in the Abraham and Sarah story when they decide to do things their own way. Hagar becomes a tree of testing and they fail the test. So there's this repeat pattern in it. And then in verse 18, and on that too, this goes back to that term that we looked at, the word for helper, or when God says, I will make a helper, when it talked about making Eve or making woman out of the side. And how that word actually doesn't mean assistant or anything like that. It's the indispensable other, without whom the desired good cannot happen. And because they are supposed to be a unit, if you will, that you can't have one without the other. If one functions bad, it causes the other to function bad as well and not walk out their purpose. And then going on to verse 18, it says, thorns and thistles, the ground, it shall bring for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face, you shall eat bread. And so what's interesting about this, the ground becomes cursed. And ultimately, the humans go from being in a lush garden paradise where food is plentiful and always available to now having to labor and toil and eat the plants of the field that they labor over, rather than the food of the garden that God had provided for them. And so you see this is more than just, hey, you're going to have to start farming in this case. This is ultimately you're going to be banished from the presence of God. And so what's interesting here is transitioning on. It goes right from this verse 19 right here, where it says, till you return from the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The very next line says, the man called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. It's just, okay, you just went through this terrible list of consequences, and then, oh, by the way, her name was Eve. And that seems like almost an odd transition point, if you will. But what I'm getting at here is that you see this pattern, Eve and living. She's named Eve because she was the mother of the living. In Hebrew, it's a word play. Eve's name is the Hebrew word chava, and it literally means life or living. And so you see this name pattern. It's actually a continuation of the name pattern from Genesis chapter 1, but you see this naming pattern of someone being named that indicates, in this case, how Eve is correlated to living, how the words are correlated. You see that same naming and correlation pattern throughout the Bible. It actually starts in Genesis chapter 1 when God creates light, and he calls the light day. And then it continues on into the New Testament too, where in Matthew's gospel, it's talking about Mary. It says, she will bear a son, and you shall call his name, in Hebrew, Yeshua, for he will save his people from their sins. Yeshua in their language meant the Lord is my salvation or salvation. And so you see this naming play continue all throughout the story. This is not something just unique to this 11 chapters. Again, this is an introduction on how names and people are introduced. And finally, in verse 21 says, "And the Lord made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them." So remember how they tried to cover themselves with the figs of the tree because they were ashamed of their nakedness. God actually provides a sacrifice out of animal skins for them. And then again, many have pointed to, and I think rightly so, that this is a correlation between a sacrifice being made for the sin of people. But along with this is where some texts, and I believe it's the oldest manuscripts really available, they actually have a break in the section right here. In other words, this is where the narrative of all of Genesis chapter 2 and 3 would end right here. Now, Genesis chapter 3 goes on 4 more verses, but I think, and it ends with the humans being banished, but I think what's interesting is that the text ending here is that this section break, and it was meant to be, these are sections you read and then go back and digest from the way I understand it. This section, if it ends here, would actually end with an act of grace from God after the humans fall. So you have this fall, these consequences, and then you have God's atoning, covering grace for them. Now, again, with this, just correlating this to what we'll see in chapter 4, this naming pattern, when Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another seed. There's that word seed again, instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. So Seth and appointed in Hebrew are actually related words. They sound very similar to one another. And also, here's the final 3 verses of chapter 3. This is when, again, the Lord says, "Behold, the man," or the human, "has become like one of us." I say the human because that's that word ha-adam, where it's a prefix added to, it really just means humanity. But behold, the human has become like one of us, knowing good and bad. That's why I'd reference it's possibly you would be like gods. In other words, you would be like residents of the spiritual realm if you'd eaten the fruit. Now lest he, and it continues, "Now lest he reach out and take his hand and also take of the tree of life and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the human, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." So this is where the humans are banished from God's paradise in the story. And you can see they go east. They travel east. That's going to be important. But they go to work the ground from which they were taken. So if we look back to chapter 2, when the man was originally created out of the dust, really out of the dust and water, the clay, the mud mixture, God took him out of a barren wasteland, essentially, placed him in this lush garden, and because the humans decided to do it their own way, instead of doing it God's way, they decided to try and acquire knowledge of good and bad their own way. That's actually, in biblical terms, that's how you would talk to a child. So it's implying that there's this childlike nature to Adam and Eve, but they return to that original ground, that barren wasteland. And then again, east of the garden. And the reason that this is important is, and this is, what is his name? It's a scholar. His name is Michael Morales. I don't know if he drew this picture, but this is a correlation that he's made, that when you look at Eden and when you look at the tabernacle and the temple, you essentially have a mirror image of one another. And if you actually follow this, there's the center of the garden, the tree of life, and you can see coming east here, there's the cherubim that guard the way, and then it branches off. There's the 4 rivers that we covered. It's the same pattern going from the Holy of Holies all the way out. And you can see this actually, you move east out of the temple. So there's this narrative and there's this correlation they want you to draw that as you see the temple show up later in the story, it is a mirror image of Eden. And that's because the temple and the tabernacle were the place that God could come and dwell with his people. It's literally a temporary Eden, if you will. It's a traveling temporary Eden throughout the desert until they reach the promised land of Israel, where God establishes his temple, and then ultimately he's going to come back and reclaim the earth. So that's really what's going on here. And then One last thing before we jump into Genesis chapter 4. Again, this is the theme we looked at a little bit ago, but this one line in chapter 22 right here. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. This seems to imply that humans would not have lived forever because they had to eat from the tree of life to do so, and God is preventing that. And so this, I grew up at least hearing that, if Adam and Eve had never sinned, they'd still be alive, essentially in one way, shape, or form or the other. But this right here seems to imply that humans were not immortal leading up to this time. And so it doesn't really give us any more on that. I think this is really because we're asking questions that likely the ancient audience was not asking. But it's something interesting to think about.